No, no, not yet. Yes, we are live.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to this lecture of this lecture series, An Evening with an Expert. And in today's talk, we have Dr. Subhashree Basu. And her topic for the talk is Most Flippant Young Flappers Are We? Reading the women characters in F. Scott Fitzgerald's The Saturday Evening Post stories. I'll give you a brief introduction to Dr. Subhashree Basu before we move on to her talk. Uh, so, Subhashree Basu is an assistant professor, Department of English, Loreto College. She has earned her doctoral degree from Jadavpur University, Kolkata in 2017. Her areas of research include modern American literature, Caribbean and American literature, Australian literature, short story, partition literature, and literature of the Romantic period. Her recent publications include Henry James, The Ambassadors, in the American novel From Hawthorne to Heller, Cultural Context and Critical Perspectives. This has been published from Macmillan in 2020. Dissenting Voices in Gwendolyn Brooks' Poetry in Aspects of Modernity, American Women's Poetry, Kolkata 2014. She has also edited the seventh volume of Critical Imprints, the peer reviewed annual journal of the Department of English, Loreto College. She has presented papers at a number of national and international conferences and was nominated for the US State Department of Education's International Visitors Leadership Program titled Developing American Studies Curricula in 2011. She was also selected for an international workshop, South Asian Cultural Studies, in conversation with Ashish Nondi at the Institute of Advanced Communication and Research, Kathmandu, Nepal, in April 2013. She was awarded the Fulbright Nehru Doctoral and Professional Research Fellowship 2013 to 14 for her doctoral research and took classes in the graduate and postgraduate sections in the Department of American and English Literature, Rutgers, New Jersey, during her stay in the US. She's a core member of South Asian Foundation for Academic Research, a forum of researchers and scholars from Bangladesh, India, Pakistan, Nepal, and Sri Lanka committed to the study of South Asia. She has been working as a volunteer teacher at Vivek Vani, a free evening school for intercity working class children from the underprivileged background since 2008. She has received the Federal Assistance Award in 2021 from the US State Department for her ongoing project, A Place for US Tales from a New Nation. Over to you, Shubhasree.
Thank you so much. Um, a very good evening to all of you, and I'm really grateful to the Department of English Gokhale Memorial Girls College for inviting me and giving me this opportunity to share my work. With International Women's Day just, a few days away, I wondered if we could review the position of white American young women 100 years ago. So here I am. All of us have our hobby horses, and this seems to be mine. A few points that I need to make before launching into a full discussion of the subject that I have chosen for today. Number one, you can see the title, Reading the Women Characters in Fitzgerald's The Saturday Evening Post Stories. Now, I have used the Saturday Evening Post in a generic sense. Saturday Evening Post is a journal. I have used the name in a generic sense to refer to all those high circulating popular magazines which came to be called slicks for the glossy papers that they would use. The magazine market has always been heavily stratified, and Fitzgerald, though he wrote a few stories, some of his best and in fact most experimental stories were written for a highbrow magazine called the Smart Set. Most of his stories were written for popular magazines like the Post. Secondly, Fitzgerald's love affairs and his relationship with his wife Zelda have been the subject of many books, studies, films, um, series, and his undulating relationship with Zelda does inform his depiction of female characters. However, this particular aspect is something that I have not been able to fully develop, especially for today's presentation. It is not something that I will be able to accommodate in today's presentation. And finally, I have based my study, my arguments primarily on his short stories today, and it is beyond my scope in this presentation to include discussion of his novels. So with that, I'll just begin my presentation. I'll begin by showing you a slide. I hope this is visible. I'll just read the lines. Flappers are we, flappers are we, flappers and fly and free, never too slow, all on the go, petting parties with the smarties, dizzy with dangerous glee, Puritans knock us because the way we are clad. Preachers all mock us because we are not bad. Most flippant young flappers are we. Now, these lines were recited by a group of girls in the 1925 Broadway musical No No Nanette. So, just as the play begins, as the musical begins, we have a group of girls entering the stage reciting these lines. The lyrics are by Vincent Yeomans. Keeping, this image, this popular image of flappers in mind, I'll start my presentation. F. Scott Fitzgerald, usually credited with creating and popularizing the flapper figure in his fiction, offers a deep engagement with his social and cultural milieu. One disclaimer, Fitzgerald did not create the flapper figure, or he did not coin the term flapper. Almost synonymous with the jazz age or the roaring 20s, his name immediately conjures the picture of unbridled freedom, fashionable cars, short skirts, tops with low necklines, hedonistic parties, romance. His portrayal of women was significantly informed by the contemporary discourses on women's liberation and a certain shift in the social and cultural position of women. 1920 is often viewed as the end of first wave feminism and the beginning of the second wave feminism in the United States of America. Apart from women getting the right to vote as a result of the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, there was another major factor which led to an increase in the participation of women in the public sphere. In the absence of a major portion of the male working force during the First World War, more and more women were compelled to take up jobs, and their engagement in public life definitely increased. The flapper figure gained ascendancy because of the First World War and the 19th Amendment. Flapper as a term has slightly problematic roots. By the late 19th and early 20th century, it had come to signify a young prostitute and later someone who flouted moral conventions and norms. The derogatory nature of the term was later deployed to mock girls who openly showed their disdain for conventional rules and norms. the imagery inherent in the term, a young bird trying to flap its wings, is also indicative of the male anxiety that the period witnessed. This male anxiety was further fueled by the magazines and tabloids with reports and illustrations of haughty women disregarding conservative rules. Synonymous with unconventionality and freedom, even licentiousness, the flappers as a group came to represent those women who drove automobiles, went to parties unchaperoned, wore short skirts, bobbed their hair, drank, smoked, and impertinently defied the norms of sexuality and religion. Let us look at a few instances from the visual culture of the period to see how flappers were perceived by the society in general. This is an illustration by John Held Jr., a very famous illustrator from the 1920s of America. And as you can see, the cartoon, the illustration represents a woman whose stockings are quite low. So her bare legs can be seen. She is about to lit a cigarette, and this man is offering her a bottle perhaps of gin, and it's 1925, the car, and these are tropes that we find in literature from this period. If you look at The Great Gatsby, if you look at Sinclair Lewis, if you look at their works, you find that these are some of the tropes that are very familiar to all of us. And there is definitely something very audacious about the way this girl has been projected in the illustration. The next illustration is from the commencement number of Life, again, a very famous magazine. This is 1926. And the illustration is called The Sweet Girl Graduate. And as you can see, she is sitting on this upturned chair, smoking, her legs up, and the stance is definitely one of defiance and perhaps insolence. And she has just earned her degree, so here is a cap to indicate that. The next image that I want to show you is very interesting. It's an advertisement by a brand of cigarettes called Lucky. And Lucky Cigarettes tried to advertise themselves and endorse smoking for women as something that would help them retain their slim figures. So it was supposed to be a slimming aid. Light a Lucky and you will never miss sweets that make you fat. So if you light a Lucky, you won't have the urge to have sweets, and therefore you will remain slim and in shape. So my purpose in showing you these images was to sort of assert that these are the kind of visual representations we find from that period, and this is how women are being they are acting, and this is how they are being perceived by the society. Ironically, we hear women voices are not that prominently represented, so we don't know what the women had to say. Perhaps we will have time to discuss that later. Now, Fitzgerald was clearly enamored of the flapper figure. Ginevra King, Fitzgerald's first love and the model for Daisy in The Great Gatsby, as well as Zelda, his wife, are quintessential flappers. He was clearly fascinated by women who audaciously flouted conventional norms and asserted their autonomy in society. G. Forster, in his essay F. Scott Fitzgerald, Modernist Studies and the Fin de Siècle Crisis in Masculinity, observes that his deep fascination for these assertive women was coupled with a strong desire to possess and control that woman. I quote from Forster, quotes open, Zelda combined her conventionally feminine attributes with the more daringly reckless and unfeminine qualities of a new woman. She drank and smoked and bobbed her hair. She had premarital sexual affairs. She made it clear that she would not play the role of a submissive housewife. And she displayed a fierce independence that she herself characterized as an inclination towards masculinity. Zelda's conventionally feminine characteristics inspired in him a desire for possession, a yearning to demonstrate his manhood by attaining her. Quotes closed. This dichotomy of fascination and control is exhibited in most of the early stories. In a story called The Offshore Pirate, written for the Saturday Evening Post in 1920, a young girl, Adita, wants to marry a philanderer against her uncle's wishes. This is how a 19-year-old Adita answers her uncle when he wants to talk to her on a matter of some import. Will you stop boring me? Will you go away? Will you jump overboard and drown? Do you want me to throw this book at you? Quotes closed. The impudent Adita then flings a book at her uncle. The book is Anatole France's The Revolt of Angels, the 1914 satiric novel where an angel, Arcade, wishes to overthrow God, must have appealed to young people like Adita, for whom conventions and religion are mere ploys to stifle them, to stifle the young people. The rejection of all kinds of authority therefore becomes attractive. Adita finally, and this is the resolution that Fitzgerald thinks of, Adita finally ends up marrying someone her uncle has chosen for her. Fitzgerald paints her as this lovable brash, whose juvenile, puerile actions and behavior need chastising, but not at the cost of her happiness. In another story, Rags Martin Jones and Prince of Wales, written for McCall's in 1924, it's written in a similar vein as that of the Offshore Pirate. Fitzgerald creates this, taming of the shrew premise with a headstrong and audacious girl being taught a lesson by her future husband. So she's also rebellious, but we cannot be too judgmental about her. We end up liking her, and she's taught a lesson, and, she undergoes a change of heart and ends up marrying the man who is right for her. Now, in both these stories, the female protagonist's insolence and love for independence is treated with a certain indulgence. Rather than, projecting the image of an empowered femininity, characters like Adita or Rags Jones demonstrate an acute lack of agency. There is an unmissable indication of infantilization of women in many of Fitzgerald's early stories. Now, why did Fitzgerald portray these audacious and apparently rebellious characters as endearing but immature, requiring only male intervention to tame them into submissiveness and docility? In a letter written to his younger sister Annabel, a 19-year-old Fitzgerald had written. Now, this is a 19-year-old Fitzgerald writing to his 5 years younger sister. I quote, "As you get a little old, you will find that boys like to talk about such things as smoking and drinking. Always be very liberal. Boys hate a prick. Tell them you don't object to a girl smoking but don't like cigarettes yourself. In your conversation, always affect a complete frankness, but really be only as frank as you wish to be. Learn to be worldly. Remember, in all society, 9 out of 10 girls marry for money, and 9 men out of 10 are fools." Quotes closed. Entrenched in patriarchal ideology, Fitzgerald clearly views an advantageous marriage as the only desirable and logical goal for a woman. Also, the magazines Fitzgerald was writing for, as I said, he was much more experimental in his smart set stories, but he was primarily writing for the slick magazines. And these magazines, the Saturday Evening Post or Scribner's, Hearst's magazine, McCall's, these were high circulating magazines that catered to bourgeois middle class values. As Shelley Ashkenaz has observed, marriage never lost its validity even for the flappers. I quote from Shelley Ashkenaz, "Flapper culture was a gift that allowed young women in America to experiment with the new forms of racy female behavior, enjoying themselves and experiencing varying levels of personal growth, yet not jeopardizing their ability to make an appropriate marriage." Quotes closed. Ralph Andrist, in the American Heritage History of the 20s and 30s, notes that the Saturday Evening Post, the self-appointed guardian of traditional American values, eventually began to allow drinking, petting, and infidelity to be mentioned in the stories it ran. However, subjects like smoking or petting had to remain within a strictly moral framework. The middle class readership could at best accept a light-hearted joke on conventional morality, but nothing more. This attitude towards women in an age that saw very independent and self-made women like, the comedian singer Fanny Brice, writer and satirist Dorothy Parker, actress and entrepreneur Texas Guinan, dominate the social and cultural milieu of the nation. They were dominating the cultural milieu of this time. So this kind of an attitude towards women, when there were so many of these independent and self-made women surviving and almost ruling the society in a way, if possible I'll talk about it, it is not surprising. The peremptory manner in which characters like Ardita or Rags speak is a reflection of the mannerisms of these real life figures. For instance, Texas Guinan, running a number of speakeasies in New York, was famous or infamous for, I quote from Lucy Moore, possessing one of the rudest mouths in town, with which she would genially insult patrons ranging from society leaders and film stars to gangsters and tourists. These women knew how to hold their own. And as a result of which, there was a growing anxiety and insecurity about the changing status of women in the American society, something that was a threat to the existing social balance. The songwriter and actor Hoagy Carmichael said, I quote, "The post-World War came in with a bang of bad booze, flappers with bare legs, jangled morals, and wild weekends." Quotes closed. This anxiety is articulated in many of Fitzgerald's short stories, and I shall briefly discuss two of them: Head and Shoulders and What a Handsome Pair. In both the stories, marriages are put under stress because of the competition between husband and wife. In Head and Shoulders is a relatively early story written in either in 1919 or 1920. Uh, in this story, a young prodigy is compelled to sacrifice his intellectual aspirations because of a hasty marriage. His semi educated wife accidentally ends up becoming a celebrated author, while her scholarly husband ends up losing his intellectual credentials at the altar of domesticity. Now, what happens in this story is that there is a light bantering tone that Fitzgerald adopts. So, after their marriage, the couple called themselves head and shoulders. The husband standing for head and the wife standing for shoulders, because she was a dancer. However, there is a twist at the end. The husband, in order to provide for his family, becomes an acrobat, and the woman, the wife, she ends up writing a diary in the last few months of her pregnancy and becomes a celebrated author. And the story ends with a newspaper article that says that the couple likes to call themselves Head and Shoulders, possibly referring to the wife as head because she's the celebrated author, and the man as shoulders. Now, there was something rather amusing about the way in which the whole issue has been treated, yet one cannot miss the anxiety that Fitzgerald is communicating in this story. This is an early story. Now, this tone becomes much more cynical and bitter in a story like What a Handsome Pair, written in 1932. In this story, a marriage is on the verge of collapse because the husband has been dwarfed by the wife's achievements. In contrast, a society gentleman marries an illiterate waitress and says, I quote from the story, quotes open, people tried to make marriages cooperative and they have ended by becoming competitive. Impossible situation. Smart men will get to fight shy of ornamental women. A man ought to marry somebody who will be grateful, like Betty here. Quotes closed. This heteropatriarchal male anxiety is confirmed by Quentin E. Martin, who has suggested that, I quote, to many men and women, the women was an additional threat to the social fabric, one already thinned by immigration, labor unrest, religious indifference, and other factors. Quotes closed. Concurrently, another concept gained currency during this period, that of the new woman. The term was used for women who asserted their intellectual, professional, and sexual freedom and refused to be subdued by patriarchal domination. Someone like Gertrude Stein would be a new woman. As Lilia Melanie has observed, the new woman, I quote, typically values self-fulfillment and independence, believes in legal and sexual equality, often remains single because of the difficulty of combining such equality with marriage, is more open about her sexuality than the old woman, is well educated, and reads a great deal, has a job, is athletic or otherwise physically vigorous, and accordingly prefers comfortable clothes, sometimes male attire, to traditional female garb. Quotes closed. While there are scholars who have considered flappers and new women as synonymous in Fitzgerald's fiction, I think Fitzgerald makes a distinction between the two categories. He creates a new woman prototype in a story called Myra Meets His Family, where the female protagonist is humiliated by her lover and avenges herself by staging a sham marriage with him and then abandoning him for good. However, this is a rare instance where a woman rejects a marriage of convenience for the sake of self respect. Most of Fitzgerald's characters, especially the ones created for the high circulating popular magazines, are too flippant and immature to be called new women. There are times, albeit, when Fitzgerald fuses the attributes of a new woman with those of his female characters. For instance, there is one story called A Freeze Out, where the female lead character of Alida is the daughter of a local mafia. And consequently, she faces a lot of reproach and censor from the society. However, her good taste in music, her taste in books, her unbiased opinions make her more of a new woman than a flapper. But again, she eventually ends up marrying someone who truly deserves her. So marriage, never loses its credibility, and it is the one goal that all women are aspiring to, according to Fitzgerald. As the licentiousness and excesses of the 1920s came to a screeching halt with the Wall Street crash of 1929, a large section of the population became jobless. In order to supplement the dwindling family resources, women began to take up job, but this was often met with strong resistance from husbands and potential employers. Campaigns to prevent the hiring of married women were organized. Despite the opposition, women entered the workforce in increasing numbers. So from 10 million at the start of the Depression to nearly 30 million by the end of the 1930s. This increase took place in spite of the 26 states that passed a variety of laws to prohibit the employment of married women. Several women found employment in the emerging, pink-collar occupations, which are today viewed as very traditional women's work, telephone operators, social workers, secretarial work, even nurses, and others took jobs as maids and house cleaners, working for those affluent families who had somehow managed to maintain their wealth. However, again, there was a sense of disbalance because more women are again joining the workforce and men are jobless. There is a huge unemployed male population out there. So this augmented the already existing anxiety about the gender equations and freedom of women. I'll show you another image here. So this is the photograph of a campaign run by women, by single women, against the hiring of married women. So, I'm not too sure if the resolution is good, but if you can read the boards here: fire married women, not a single job for single women, 1,000 single women need jobs. And, what is very obvious is that the marriage rate decreased considerably in the late in the 1930s, and so did the birth rate of children. So fewer children were born in the 1930s, and few women got married for a variety of reasons which are not too difficult to guess. Now, Fitzgerald, though as a writer, he was not directly affected by the Great Depression, but he did remark that the mad party was over for him, and he saw it as the end, with the crack up being a part of the curriculum almost everywhere in India now. One can see the cynicism, the skepticism that crept into Fitzgerald in the 1930s, and how he nostalgically looks back at the roaring 20s. And what it results in Fitzgerald is this disparaging and censorious approach to women, which is again a sign of a larger malady. This is adequately represented in the Josephine Perry stories. This is a story cycle that Fitzgerald wrote in 1930. The central character is that of Josephine Perry. She's a rich, beautiful, and much sought after flapper. In fact, many scholars argue that the character of Josephine is also based on Ginevra King, the girl who rejected Fitzgerald. So, this much sought after flapper, Josephine, who is morally punished for being a speed. Now, speed is a sort of colloquial term used for men and women who would have a number of casual affairs. So infidelity, insincerity in romantic affairs was not something very rare. In fact, the final story of this sequence, of this story cycle, Fitzgerald, the story is called Emotional Bankruptcy. This is the last of the Josephine Perry stories, and here Josephine, who is a famed beauty, she has depleted all her emotional resources as a result of her numerous romantic adventures. So now, emotionally exhausted, she finds herself incapable of love when a man she truly likes appears. I'm quoting from the story, "One cannot both spend and have." The love of her life had come by, and looking in her empty basket, she had found not a flower left for him, not one. Quotes closed. The language and the moral underpinning of the story are predictably bourgeois and almost Victorian. Josephine retains her beauty or, external value, but has spent her internal resources. I'm sort of putting these within quotes, in the numerous casual affairs she has had. Using the term bankruptcy to describe the mental and emotional state that Josephine experienced, Fitzgerald was appeasing the perfunctory morality of the middle-class readers of the Saturday Evening Post, who would be pleased at the final punishment that had been meted out to a girl like Josephine, to whom her marriage is denied. Marriage is denied to her, and that is like the last and the ultimate punishment that can be meted out to girl. And here I would, like you to remember the first few stories that I mentioned, where the rebellious characters are treated with a certain indulgence, and they are tamed, and they are projected, or they are portrayed as lovable people, very endearing, and they are taught a lesson, and finally they get married. But Josephine, by this time, by 1930, Fitzgerald is so cynical about women, and, he has become so censorious that he feels it necessary to punish a person like Josephine. Um, so her casual affairs, would have made her morally questionable in the eyes of the Post readers. Now, what is ironical is that there were men speeds as well, but men are preempted from such reprehension. One should also remember that most of the stories written for Post and other slick magazines have women as central characters. Now, there is a reason for it. Magazines catering to a largely female readership had been in operation since the early 19th century. But as female literacy increased, the circulation of magazines such as Ladies' Home Journal, Good Housekeeping, Women's Home Companion increased significantly. I'm showing you the cover page of the January 1932 issue of Women's Home Companion. I'm sorry, I think I'm facing a technical problem, as a result of which I'm not being able to share my screen. So I'll just I'm not too sure if I can be heard.
Yes, you are audible. You are audible. Subhashree, you are audible. Subhashree, you are audible.
Okay, I'm audible. Thank you for confirming. So I'll just go ahead. So, the cover page of this issue of Woman's Home Companion has the picture of a nurse with two babies. And, the nurse as well as the babies look absolutely angelic. This image of women as caregiver is being glorified. And the other kind of cover pages would show women as mothers taking their children in parks, out for a stroll, or cleaning their houses, cooking in the kitchen. So these magazines targeted white middle class women who took their role as wife, mother, and homemaker very seriously. It seems that women themselves often questioned the limits of their newfound independence. If we look at the range of women characters that Fitzgerald has portrayed in his writings, they are rebellious, audacious, insolent, and impudent. But at the end of the day, all of them have a single goal of marrying and securing a stable marriage, of marrying someone stable, someone wealthy, and being good housewives. As a reference point, you can think of Daisy. Now, in popular representations, think about Woody Allen's Midnight in Paris. The Jazz Age comes across as a period that ushered in a new sense of freedom, in fashion, in moral codes and conduct, and a clear rejection of puritanical values and ideologies. If you remember the lyrics that I showed at the beginning of my presentation, flappers are we? The flappers are simply challenging the preachers who do not like them because the way they are clad, and they are up in arms against puritanical morality. At this point, I would request Durba to play a clipping from the 1974 adaptation of The Great Gatsby. Durba, if you
Sure,
could
sure, sure.
play that video clipping. Okay, I think you can stop now.
Okay, sure, sure.
You know, the every time I look at the party scenes, I sort of feel giddy, and one can see a certain nervous energy in the way these parties are presented in films or in television series. The women, dancing in knee-length dresses, dancing to Charleston with often bare legs, seem to be posing a threat to conventional values. While this view is not completely baseless, a close reading of Fitzgerald's fiction confirms that the American society was more pretending to be modern and progressive than it actually was. The subterranean conservatism and a deep desire to keep the status quo, to keep the power relations intact, be it in the case of race or gender, remained and thrived. Thank you so much. I would very much invite questions or comments, if any.
Thank you, Shubhashriti. That was a very informed and engaging talk. So we do have a question, and this is by a sixth semester student from our college, from our department, Shampurna Chaudhuri, and I am reading this out. So she asks, respected ma'am, as you mentioned in heads and shoulders, heads refer to the wife and shoulders to the husband. Does it somehow, and I'm assuming this word, change the notion of Eve being born from the arms of Adam? Shubhashriti, can you hear me?
I had to
Shubhashriti,
log
can
out.
you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Okay. So I will just repeat the question. Shampurna asks, respected ma'am, as you mentioned in heads and shoulders, heads refer to the wife and shoulders to the husband. does it somehow change the notion of Eve being born from the arms of Adam?
I'm not too sure, if Fitzgerald was thinking too deeply about this. He was a very young man at this time. He was about 22 years old when he wrote this story, 22 or 23 years old, and he had recently got married to Zelda. So he was thinking about the idea of competitiveness in marriage. And Head and Shoulders seemed like a catchy title to him. And as I said, that initially the husband was supposed to be the head. He's the student of philosophy in a university, in a Ivy League university. And the wife is simply a dancer, so she is called Shoulders. However, things change as they get into this hasty marriage. And the wife, during her pregnancy cannot dance and hence cannot earn money, so the husband is forced to take up odd jobs, and he ends up becoming an acrobat, very interestingly. And as a result of which, and the wife ends up writing a diary which is then published, and she becomes a celebrated author. And the newspaper clipping says that, look, this couple calls itself Head and Shoulders, no doubt head referring to the wife, and shoulder, the husband being referred to as the shoulder. So Eve being born out of Adam is a trope, is a very conventional trope, and especially in gender studies, in feminist studies, we constantly go back to it. Here, I'm not too sure if Fitzgerald was, consciously thinking of this particular image. He was simply looking at the gender equation in a marriage and how an imbalance can often happen. Thank you for the question, though.
She has replied, thank you, ma'am, for that enlightening session. And now, I do not think that we have further questions from the students, but I really found your talk engaging and very informative. And I have a question in retrospect, which is
Sure.
that since you're speaking of marriage and speaking of marriage in terms of the early 20th American society, and marriage as a theme in novels appear in British literature, for instance, in Austen's writings, so very prominently, right? So when we are thinking of Austen's engagement with the idea of marriage and the representation of Fitzgerald's idea of marriage in his texts, how far are the two similar, or are they different? This is what
Different.
I
Yes. This is what I was trying to engage with. This is exactly my point, that it might seem that the society has come a great deal away from Jane Austen, where marriage seems to be the only prospect for a woman. And if you think of a novel like Odd Women by George Gissing in the Victorian period, this idea of odd women who do not get married, and what happens to them, what, their status, and the sheer helplessness and vulnerability that women might face in case they fail to get married. So on one hand, in the early 20th century, as I said, there were women who chose to remain unmarried for various reasons, who dressed, so androgyny became a very common trope. So many women dressed like men. However, for the the major section of the population, marriage never lost its credibility. So the new things that were happening, women began to drive, they could now go to parties unchaperoned. As far as fashion was concerned, they could be more experimental. They started wearing more and more makeup, so the cosmetics industry also received a major boost. So these external factors or extrinsic factors did receive a major, they remained, or they had changed. However, at the core of it, marriage did not lose its validity, because for all women, that was the only outcome. And as you can see, Fitzgerald is constantly emphasizing the need for a good marriage. And so he does to his 15-year-old sister as well. So it's not actually
Thank you.
different from Jane Austen, I would say.
Even 100 years later, almost more than a few years
Yes,
above
yes,
100.
yes.
So
Yes,
unfortunately.
absolutely.
Okay. Thank you, Shubhashree. I believe we have no more questions. So I would request Rajkumar Borman, our head of the department, to pick up from here and deliver the vote of thanks.
Well, am I audible, Durga?
Yes, you are. You're
Hello.
perfectly audible.
Okay. So, good evening, everyone. I feel honored to have been asked for the vote of thanks. First of all, I want to thank Dr. Subhashree Basu for an insightful and illuminating lecture on women characters in Fitzgerald's The Saturday Evening Post stories, in which you have very lucidly talked about the freedom and emancipation of women with reference to the flappers and their cultures. Secondly, I want to thank our principal ma'am, Dr. Otoshi Karpa, for encouraging us, and I must thank all my departmental colleagues for constantly supporting in order to make this program a success. And thanks due to all our viewers for whom the program has actually been designed. Thank you once again, Shubhashree ma'am.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you.